Welcome to F1 Blocks, your one-stop shop for all things Formula One.
And today, what we're diving deep into, a conflict that's really kind of shaking up the sport. And it's not about, rivalries out there on the track, but a real clash between the drivers and the FIA, the governing body of the sport. And right at the heart of it all is this question of money, power,
And transparency.
yeah, and Mundo Deportivo, which is a pretty prominent Spanish sports publication. They captured this tension perfectly in an article they did. It was called Los pilotos cobran cientos de millones, les pregunto en qué se lo gastan. And that basically translates to, the drivers earn hundreds of millions. Should I ask them what they spend it on?
Whoa. That title really kind of throws some shade, doesn't it? So this isn't just about the drivers wanting a bigger piece of the pie, then, is it?
Not exactly. The article really highlights this growing sense of frustration, I think, among the drivers, they feel like. Their concerns about how the FIA manages the sport's finances are just being dismissed. They've gotten a lot more vocal this year. They've even launched their own social media platform to air these grievances.
Interesting. So how has the FIA responded to this kind of increased pressure?
Well, let's just say that the FIA president, Mohammed Ben Sulayem, he isn't backing down. The article quotes him responding to the drivers' concerns with a pretty pointed remark, I'd say. He said, the drivers receive more than $100 million. Do I ask them what they spend it on?
Ouch. That sounds like a recipe for even more tension.
Yeah, it doesn't really suggest a willingness to, engage in an open dialogue. And this dismissive attitude is exactly what fuels the drivers' concerns about specific issues, like the FIA's approach to on-track radio communications.
Oh, you mean when drivers get a little heated in the heat of the moment, let some colorful language fly over the airwaves.
Exactly. Think back to Charles Leclerc's outbursts last season or Max Verstappen's, colorful commentary during the Monaco Grand Prix. These incidents often result in fines. But the Grand Prix Drivers Association, or GPD, argues that these fines, they often seem arbitrary and lack clear guidelines.
So it's not just about the money itself then, but the perceived lack of transparency and fairness in how these penalties are applied.
Precisely. This lack of clarity, it fuels these suspicions about how the money from those fines is actually being used. And it ties into a broader concern about the consistency and the professionalism of the race stewards.
Right. These are the officials who make those crucial decisions during the race, right? Like handing out penalties, rule violations.
Yep. They're essentially the referees of Formula One. George Russell, the current GPD president, has even suggested that the FIA should consider hiring and training dedicated stewards, similar to professional soccer leagues.
That sounds like a pretty reasonable suggestion to ensure fairness and expertise. So what's the FIA's stance on that?
Well, Ben Sulayem claims that the FIA simply doesn't have the funds to implement such a system.
Wait, hold on. The FIA, which governs one of the most lucrative sports in the world, is claiming they can't afford to invest in professional race officiating. That's hard to believe.
Yeah, it creates a perception problem, doesn't it? You have drivers earning millions, while the organization overseeing them pleads poverty when it comes to ensuring a level playing field.
It's like they're speaking two different languages. The drivers are asking for accountability and a voice in shaping the sport, while the FIA just seems to be resorting to a we know best approach.
And that's where things get really interesting, because this tension, it reveals a much deeper power struggle within Formula One. The drivers aren't content to just focus on racing anymore. They're demanding a seat at the table when it comes to the rules, the regulations, and the financial decisions that impact their livelihoods and the sport's future. And this shift in driver activism could have some pretty profound implications for Formula One. What are your thoughts on the potential consequences of this conflict?
Well, would things escalate further? I mean, could we see a complete breakdown in communication between the drivers and the FIA?
That's certainly a possibility. And it could lead to, further disputes, boycotts even, or even legal battles. Imagine a driver refusing to race because they disagree with a steward's decision, or like a GPD-led strike over financial transparency. That would be a major blow to the sport.
Yeah, and for the fans, too. No one wants to see a season disrupted by off-track politics.
Yeah.
But could this conflict, as heated as it is, also be a catalyst for positive change?
Absolutely. It's forcing the FIA to confront some uncomfortable truths about how they operate. It could lead to increased accountability, transparency, and a more collaborative approach to decision-making. Perhaps we'll see clearer regulations, more consistent officiating, and a fairer distribution of resources.
It's a bit of crossroads then. This conflict could either lead to chaos Or a much-needed evolution of the sport? What are some of the key factors that'll determine which path Formula One takes?
I think one crucial element will be the role of the teams. Will they side with the FIA, the drivers, or will they try to play like a mediating role? Their influence and financial power can't be ignored.
It's interesting to consider because the teams have their own complex relationships with the FIA and the drivers. They're kind of caught in the middle.
Exactly. And then there's the factor of public opinion. How will fans react to this conflict? Will they side with their favorite drivers, or will they just see this as like a distraction from the on-track action?
Yeah, I think. Social media will likely play a huge role in shaping the narrative and amplifying certain voices.
You're right. And don't forget about the media itself. How they cover this conflict will definitely influence public perception and could potentially pressure the FIA to act.
It's almost like watching a political thriller unfold in real time. There are so many moving parts, competing interests, powerful personalities.
And this is where I think history can offer some valuable insights. Formula One has seen its share of power struggles in the past. The infamous FISA-FOCA war of the 1980s. It's a prime example.
Yeah. Refresh my memory. Who were FISA and FOCA? And what were they fighting about?
So FISA, the Fédération Internationale du Sport Automobile, that was the precursor to the FIA. And FOCA, the Formula One Constructors Association, represented the teams. Essentially, it was this battle for control over the sport, with Bernie Ecclestone the mastermind behind FOCA, pushing for more commercial rights for the teams and a greater share of the revenue.
Ah, okay. Sounds familiar. Teams versus the governing body. A power struggle for the ages.
It was a really intense period, with threats of boycotts and breakaway series. It took years of negotiations and compromises to reach a kind of stable agreement.
So is history destined to repeat itself? Are we heading towards another protracted war of attrition?
Not necessarily. While there are parallels, there are also some key differences. The drivers are now playing a much more active and vocal role. Back in the FISA-FOCA days, it was primarily a fight between the teams and the governing body. Now, you have the drivers adding their influence and leverage to the equation.
Right, they have immense global reach and a dedicated fan base. Their voices carry weight.
Exactly. The fact that they're willing to speak out publicly, even if it risks alienating, those in power, demonstrates their commitment to shaping the sport's future.
It's a bold move, but it also reflects a growing awareness, I think, of their collective power.
They're not just employees, they're stakeholders.
Yeah.
And they're demanding to be treated as such.
This is all incredibly fascinating. So, as we head into the final part of our deep dive, what are some of the key questions we should be asking ourselves about the future of this conflict and its impact on Formula One?
Well, I think first and foremost, will the FIA genuinely listen to the drivers' concerns and embrace a more collaborative approach?
Will they double down
Yeah.
and try to reinforce their existing power structure?
That's a critical question. And will the drivers be willing to compromise, or are they prepared to take more drastic actions if their demands aren't met?
It seems like they're ready to push the boundaries.
And what role will the teams play in all of this? Will they act as mediators, or will they choose sides, further complicating the situation?
Yeah. The teams are often the quiet power brokers in Formula One. Their decisions could be decisive.
Yeah, it feels like we're on the edge of a seismic shift in Formula One. The outcome of this conflict could really redefine the balance of power for years to come.
Absolutely. It's a pivotal moment, not just for the drivers and the FIA, but for the sport as a whole. It raises some fundamental questions about governance transparency and the relationship between those who race the cars and those who set the rules.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive today, what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should really keep in mind?
Well, I think it's crucial to recognize that this conflict is a symptom of deeper issues that have been simmering for some time. It's not just a personality clash or a sudden eruption of discontent.
Right. It feels like the drivers have reached a tipping point. They're not willing to accept the status quo anymore.
Exactly. The drivers are demanding more respect, more transparency, and more influence. In shaping the sport, they risk their lives for every race weekend. Yeah, and that's a powerful message. They're not just employees. They're partners in the success of Formula One.
And that's why this conflict has the potential to be transformative. If the FIA responds constructively, it could usher in a new era of collaboration and shared responsibility. We could see more balanced decision-making, clearer regulations, and a greater focus on driver safety and well-being.
That would be a positive outcome, not just for the drivers, but for the integrity and long-term health of the sport.
But if the FIA digs its heels in, resists change, and tries to maintain its grip on power, Well, we could see even more friction and instability.
Yeah, it could lead to further disputes,
Right.
boycotts, and even legal challenges, all of which would be detrimental to the sport and its global fan base.
It's a delicate balancing act. The FIA needs to find a way to address the drivers' legitimate concerns without compromising its authority to govern the sport fairly and effectively.
This is definitely a situation we'll be watching closely here at F1 Blogs. It's a compelling story with high stakes and unpredictable outcomes.
It certainly is. And while the future of Formula One is uncertain, one thing is for sure, it's going to be a fascinating ride.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the heart of this Formula One power struggle. And for all our listeners out there, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insights, analysis, and breaking news. From the world of Formula One, we've got a ton of great videos waiting for you, covering everything from race recaps to driver interviews to behind-the-scenes exclusives.
We'll see you back here soon for another deep dive into the most exciting sport on the planet.